by firstly thanking Councillor Simon Blackburn for doing such a good job of setting the scene for the webinar. I'd also like to echo Simon's thanks to you for making time to sit through this training session when I realise there'll be many, many other priorities competing for your time. So thank you. Before we move into the webinar content proper itself, I'd like to spend just a couple of minutes talking about the way that we've structured the webinar and also some of the content that it will include. First of all, on structure, we've decided to separate the webinar into two standalone sessions. That's in order to provide some flexibility so that you can either sit through both sessions in a single sitting, or alternatively, complete the first session, take a break and come back and undertake the second session when you have time to do so. As far as content is concerned, session one, or at least the majority of the first session, is going to be devoted to ensuring that you have an awareness of how officer colleagues will be dealing with the response to the COVID-19 crisis. In particular, we're going to spend a bit of time looking at the emergency management cycle that your officer colleagues will be working through, linked to the statutory responsibilities that local authorities and other organisations have under the Civil Contingencies Act. We're then going to look at some of the specifics in terms of the role that officers will be undertaking during the response phase of the pandemic. And we're then going to change direction slightly and finish the first session by me taking the opportunity to share some thoughts on how you as local elected representatives might build and maintain the trust and confidence of your communities as we make our way through the unprecedented pandemic with which we're currently dealing. Then there'll be a break before we open session two. Session two is really going to focus specifically on the role of councillors during the COVID-19 response operation. We're going to start by having a fairly quick look at the role of senior councillors, by which I mean leaders, executive mayors and portfolio holders within local authorities. What sort of things might they be considering as they lead the political response to COVID-19? And then we're going to look in a little bit more detail during that session at the role of local ward councillors, the role that you all have during the response phase. And we'll finish with a short look forward to some of the future online workshops that myself and LGA colleagues hope will be able to put on for you to support you through the process of dealing with the COVID-19 crisis. Okay, so to start with, we're going to have a look at how the business of managing emergencies is dealt with in the UK. Emergency planning specialists use what they describe as an integrated emergency management system that's made up of 4 distinct phases. The first of which is focused on preparedness, making sure that organisations involved in dealing with emergencies are properly prepared. And that is a phase that divides up into 4 discrete areas. The first is described as anticipation, and this is really about emergency planning, emergency management specialists using all their experience, expertise and imagination to think about the kinds of things that can go wrong, whether they're linked to natural hazards such as extreme weather or pandemic illness, or indeed man-made threats such as major transport accidents or terrorist incidents. So anticipation is the start of the process. Having thought about the sorts of things that might happen, it's then necessary to evaluate the amount of risk associated with those occurrences. And there are 2 aspects to this. The first is, how likely is it that that's going to happen? And the second component is focused on, and if it were to happen, what would the consequences be? That's the risk assessment aspect of preparedness. Then, as you might expect, there is a focus on thinking about how to prevent those bad things from happening. So this is to try and take the likelihood down to a level that's low as possible before moving into the final component, which is really about preparing for the reality that those emergencies may happen, and if so, the need to mitigate their impact as much as possible. So the preparation aspect is really focused on minimising the consequences if there is a serious emergency. Having completed the preparedness phase, unfortunately, emergencies do and will continue to happen. Officers will then move into dealing with response before, at a later point in time, could be quite quick. Sometimes the response phase is long, as it's likely to be during the pandemic illness with which we're currently dealing. But at some point, you move into the process of recovery, a focus on some form of return to normality. And I use the word normal advisedly because it can often be a very new kind of normal, and I think that will certainly be the case with the coronavirus pandemic. And then finally, the fourth aspect, which is at least as important as the other three, this is really about making sure that you learn all the lessons that are available about the real world experience of having dealt with an emergency, so that that learning can be fed back into the next cycle of preparedness, response and recovery. And if this integrated emergency management process is followed well, it should create a virtuous circle that leads to continuous improvement. As far as the Civil Contingencies Act 2004 is concerned, really important piece of legislation. And it's a piece of legislation that is almost entirely focused on making sure that organisations are well prepared to deal with emergencies. There are a range of duties under the Civil Contingencies Act, and local authorities are classified alongside the blue light services, health bodies, the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency, and also the Environment Agency as Category 1 responders. They are organisations that will be at the centre of a response to a major emergency. And they come together in something called local resilience forums, which are statutory bodies that are responsible for coordinating activity that's focused on preparing really well for emergencies. And there's a number of specific duties that sit under the Civil Contingencies Act. The first involves assessing risks and writing those risks up in something called a community risk register. Having evaluated risks, putting in place emergency plans, and then making sure that you exercise those plans to test their efficacy in the real world. There's a duty to put in place business continuity management arrangements for all Category 1 responders, and that is a feature in two scenarios. First of all, if a local authority is involved in a major emergency response, the level of resources that it needs to deal with that might undermine its ability to deal with business as usual, and that needs to be planned for. The second scenario is where the organisation itself is being directly impacted by an emergency, and that therefore reduces their ability to deal with business as usual. And that could be anything from the pandemic crisis that we're currently facing to a fire that seriously damages one of the administrative buildings and so on. So business continuity management arrangements are important. Category 1 responders also need to make information available to the public and businesses. They need to warn them about the sorts of things that could happen, inform them what they need to do if those things do occur, and then provide timely, good quality advice to the public when something bad does happen. Category 1 responders are also required to share information with each other and other organisations involved in the response to make sure that there's a good degree of coordination. And then there is a final duty under the Civil Contingencies Act which only applies to local authorities, and that requires councils to provide business continuity advice to local businesses, whether they work in the commercial sector or the voluntary sector. In terms of the work that local resilience forums have been doing in relation to pandemic illness, there is good news in that this has been on the radar of emergency planners for many years. If we start at the national level, the National Risk Register, which is put together and periodically reviewed by the Cabinet Office, goes through a process of risk assessment by, first of all, as I've already mentioned, looking at the likelihood that something serious might happen, and then considering the impact. And the scatter graph that you can see on the slide positions different kinds of emergencies on the basis of how likely they are to happen and what the impact is going to be. And up there in the top right hand corner, pandemic influenza is the most significant national risk that the Cabinet Office think we may have to deal with, and that's been their view for some time. So that's the position at a national level. If we come down to LRF, Local Resilience Forum, Community Risk Register level, you'll see the national picture reflected. So if we head all the way up north to Cumbria, look at what their Community Risk Register says. In their list of top hazards, you've got influenza type disease. So colleagues up in Cumbria have been planning for an influenza type disease outbreak for some time. If we head down south to the capital, similarly, the London Risk Register includes a hazard associated with influenza type disease in pandemic, and that actually has the highest risk rating in the London Risk Register. They also have a relatively high risk rating attached to the threat of emerging infectious diseases. So there is good news in as much as all LRS, wherever they are in the United Kingdom, will have been planning for the possibility of a pandemic outbreak of the sort we're seeing now. So that's a piece of good news. The other thing to say that from a business continuity perspective, once again, all local authorities, wherever they are in the UK, will have plans in place that have been tested for ensuring that you can continue to deliver essential business whilst in parallel dealing with the COVID-19 crisis. And you will also see that any council has in place pretty well developed arrangements for providing advice to local businesses on what they need to do during an emergency. Moving on now to think about the role of officers in the COVID-19 crisis. The work that your officer colleagues do is guided at a local level by non-statutory guidance issued by central government. And where there is a need, as is the case with COVID-19, for central government support, there are a set of protocols in place described as a concept of operations that government use to link the work that they are doing in a way that complements activity happening at a local level. So what happens when there is an emergency that has a significant impact on communities? Well, the first thing that you will certainly see is the command and control infrastructure being put in place by officers, and that operates at three levels. First of all, at an operational level that's described as bronze. This is the boots on the ground response activity right at the front end of the emergency response. Where more than one organisation is responding to an emergency, there's a need for some coordination to make sure that their efforts are combined effectively. And in that scenario, you'll see a tactical level of command and control described as silver setup. Normally, as a result of more than one incident occurring simultaneously or a major emergency being spread across a number of different geographical areas, there becomes a need to coordinate tactical operations centrally. Where that's the case, strategic or gold level of command and control gets set up, and this is described as a strategic coordinating group. Essentially, the SCG is the Local Resilience Forum in battle formation. So this will be representatives from Category 1 responder organisations, including local authorities, coordinating at a very high level the response to what will always be a major emergency when you've got that level of command in place. The sequence with which the bronze, silver and gold levels of command get set up will vary depending on the type of emergency. So where, for example, you have something that's often described as a no-notice emergency, such as a major transport accident or a terrorist attack, the operational or bronze response will be put in place, and then over time you'll see tactical silver and, if necessary, the strategic gold level of command put in place. And where a no-notice event does take place, it can take quite a number of hours for the strategic level of incident command to be put in place. Conversely, if we experience something that's described as a rising tide event, which can quite literally be the risk of serious flooding taking place, for example, you very often see the command and control infrastructure being set up in the opposite order. We know that there's something big likely to happen, therefore let's start organising ourselves strategically, and only once the flooding starts taking place will you see silver, tactical and also operational bronze resources deployed to deal with an emergency. In terms of the relationship with the three levels of command and control, the strategic coordinating group members are responsible for collectively setting the overall aim and strategic objectives. Having done so, they then task the tactical level commanders with achieving those objectives by developing tactical plans. And then on down, the tactical commanders will issue instructions to bronze commanders to make sure that they are delivering the effect that is necessary right at the front end of the emergency response. So those bronze commanders deliver what's called operational effect on the ground by deploying the tactical plans. In circumstances where the emergency is having a significant impact in different areas and also has national implications, you will hear of Cobra being set up, and it's an acronym that we've all become pretty familiar with. The function of Cobra is to deal with the national consequences of what's happening, but also to provide some coordination and support to local resilience forums as they deal with the emergency response. And Cobra is quite different to the strategic coordinating groups in that, first of all, it is chaired by a government minister, a politician, whereas everybody involved in strategic coordinating groups are officers or officials. The second difference is that Cobra isn't actually part of the command and control decision-making structure. It's got a crucially important support role to play, but the decisions that are taken about the strategic objectives of an emergency response and the actions that individual organisations are going to take are the preserve of the representatives of those organisations that sit on the strategic coordinating group. So Cobra has a really important supportive and coordination role, but it doesn't have a decision-making role at the local level. The other thing to say is that whilst during response, of course, everybody's primary focus is on minimising the impact of an emergency, some people should be turning their attention to how recovery will be dealt with. Recovery operations can be very long, resource intensive and complex, and therefore the sooner people are starting to think about recovery, the better. This seems almost like a statement of the obvious, but during the COVID-19 operational response, all aspects of that command and control infrastructure and Cobra are set up. You've got strategic coordinating groups operating at a police force area. They will have various tactical coordinating groups operating underneath them, probably not geographically set up, more set up to deal with particular themes. PPE would be one obvious example in relation to COVID-19. So there's groups of people producing tactical plans on how to make sure that everybody who needs PPE in an area is getting it. And then the tactical planning activity informs what's happening at the front end operationally. You'll have seen and heard on the news that Cobra is meeting regularly, really important relationship between Cobra and the strategic coordinating groups around the country. The interface between the two is supported by officials from the Resilience and Emergencies Division at the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, known as RED. So they have a really important facilitation role to play in making sure there's good connectivity between Cobra and strategic coordinating groups. And then off to one side, you will have groups of people in all areas now turning their attention to how the recovery effort will be structured, resourced, and so on once we move out of response. Now, clearly, all of that professional activity being undertaken by officers is crucially important in enabling us to deal with the COVID-19 crisis. But in parallel with that, there's also incredibly important political work to be done. And as we move into the second of the two sessions, that's where our focus is going to be. But between now and then, I just want to spend a few minutes sharing some thoughts with you about the sorts of things that local elected members might want to think about around the concept of building and maintaining the trust and confidence of communities as we deal with an unprecedented set of circumstances. Now, the thoughts that I'm going to share with you are based on a pretty significant piece of research that's been undertaken by Bath University in conjunction with the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development. And there's been lots of material published, but perhaps the key finding from the body of research is that people who are in leadership positions build and maintain trust by exhibiting particular sorts of behaviour. And there are 4 headline behaviours that the researchers identified that they describe as pillars of trustworthy leadership. The first is ability. So people like to look at others who are in leadership roles and see people who are competent and get things done. The second pillar they describe as integrity. Now, this can mean different things to different people. In this context, integrity is all about making sure that there are no gaps between what you say you're going to do and what you are then seen to do. So proactively making commitments to do things and then following through on those commitments is a really good way of building and maintaining trust. The third area that they have discovered, they describe as predictability. And this is about people wanting to experience their interactions with others who are in leadership roles in a way that is consistent, so that they know what the experience of coming into contact with that person is going to be like. People really don't like flip-flopping behaviour. They don't like to wonder what it's going to be like to deal with somebody in a leadership role one day on the basis that it could be completely different from the experience they'd had the day before. And the final pillar of trustworthy leadership is described as benevolence. You could, I guess, describe this as empathy. And it's very much about people in leadership roles being seen to genuinely care about the impact that their leadership behaviours have on other people. And I think there's a sort of more nuanced extension of that, in that leaders are also expected to really take other people's circumstances and views properly into consideration before making decisions that have a direct impact on those people. One of the other things that I found interesting in the research is that the level of importance that's attached to each of those 4 pillars of trustworthy leadership is not a static thing. It can vary depending on leadership context. I do think, however, that red lines, non-negotiable red lines, really need to be drawn around making sure you fulfil the commitments that you've got and behaving in a consistent way over a period of time. But I do think there's an interesting interplay between the level of importance that you attach to ability, getting the job done, and benevolence, showing a level of care and respect to others, depending on the circumstances in which you're leading. And to try and illustrate this point, I'd like to draw an example from my own professional background. Here's an image, of course, of the dreadful events that unfolded at Grenfell Tower in 2017. Now, by UK Fire and Rescue Service standards, this was an absolutely unprecedented event, a fire that nobody had expected. A very fast moving and hazardous environment for responding firefighters from London Fire Brigade to deal with. But the firefighters who were committing into Grenfell when the building was on fire weren't freelancing. They were going into the building as a result of command decisions and instructions that were being given to them by others who were in leadership roles. And in those circumstances, when we're thinking about the balance between benevolence and ability, what would it have been that those firefighters really wanted to see in the leaders who were making the command decisions about whether to commit them to the building or not? I think almost certainly ability. They wanted to see in their leaders people who had the experience and expertise to make really good decisions on the basis of pretty limited information in a very fast moving environment about what firefighters should do, both to make sure that were they committed into that building, they would be doing something meaningful, and secondly, that they would have, if I'm honest, a good chance of coming out alive. So ability would have been really important. Roll the clock forward just a handful of hours to the following morning, and the firefighters who had been in head down command and control mode the night before were now, as human beings, beginning to start the process of coming to terms with what they'd been through the night before. And that, in my view, completely changed the leadership context within which senior people in London Fire Brigade were operating. And I remember very, very well watching interviews of those senior people from London Fire Brigade the morning after the emergency, when it was absolutely clear that their focus had moved away from the command and control leadership style that they would have been exhibiting during the fire to a much more benevolent leadership style, where they were obviously focused on making sure that firefighters in London Fire Brigade were getting the emotional support that they needed to come to terms with the horrific events in which they'd been involved. So an interesting balance between the two things. Now, there is some bad news, I'm afraid, about building and maintaining trust, and I think it's captured beautifully in a Scandinavian saying that trust arrives on foot and leaves on horseback. So if you want to build high levels of trust in relationships that you have with people when you're in a leadership role, it takes a concerted effort over an extended period of time. If, however long you've spent building that level of trust, you start to behave in ways that undermines the trust that people have in you, very quickly you can lose the trust. And there are various examples that I've noted of exactly this sort of thing happening. So if you accept that trust does arrive on foot and lead on horseback, then if you're in a leadership role, as you will be as ward councillors, I guess you will want to look for any and all opportunities to make deposits into your trust bank. And from a civil resilience perspective, really important to try and bank trust when you're preparing for emergencies by working with local communities. So demonstrating that you can get things done, making commitments and keeping them, thinking about other people's views when you're going through the process of trying to build community resilience so that communities are well prepared for emergencies alongside statutory agencies. So bank trust when you're preparing for an emergency, so that you become that trusted local face of the council. And if, when, heaven forbid, an emergency does occur, as the trusted local face of the council, you have at your fingertips a very, very powerful equation, because you are able to combine the high levels of trust that you have as the local face of the council with a wide local network of connections, individuals and organisations that make you a hugely valuable asset as the local ward councillor, both to the community, but also to your council. And that's something that we're going to come back to and have a closer look at during the second session. And I guess I would finish by saying that alongside your officer colleagues, it's worth thinking about how you really concentrate on maintaining the trust that you have built as we go through the process of responding to this dreadful COVID-19 crisis. So think about how you're going to get things done and be seen to get things done. Make sure that gaps don't emerge between what you say is going to happen and what people subsequently experience. Try and maintain a consistency, a regularity in the way that you behave. That provides huge reassurance to people. And finally, continue to be seen to care about the impact that COVID-19 is having on the lives of people in your areas. So that brings session one to an end. We spent some time looking at the work that your officer colleagues are going to be doing before sharing the information and the ideas that I just did about this concept that you will need to build and maintain the trust and confidence of communities during the coronavirus pandemic. We'll close down. When you come back to session two, we're really going to focus on the role of councillors. Spend a bit of time thinking about what senior councillors are likely to be doing during the COVID-19 response before looking rather more forensically at the sorts of things that local ward councillors will need to be thinking about as we make our way through the response phase. And then we'll have a final look forward to those future online workshops, as I mentioned earlier. So that is the close of session one. Thank you so much for making the time to sit through it. I hope you found it useful, and I will look forward to welcoming you back to the second session.